Going beyond the headlines. Asking the questions you want answered. Exploring government policies and how they impact you. We are delving deeper.
Good evening and welcome to Delving Deeper. I'm your host, Sunolala, and joining us this evening are Economists Dr. Marlene Attzs and Dr. Seerattan. Good evening and welcome back to the show.
Good evening and thank you.
I want to start off by getting your thoughts on the 2024-2025 fiscal package. Dr. Attzs, I know you would have, a day after the budget was read, you quoted it as saying it was a carefully, cleverly crafted budget. What was your thoughts?
Well, I maintain that it took me a while, as I said at that particular post-budget forum, that I think I was anticipating a lot more, given the alarms that both the Minister of Finance and the Honourable Prime Minister had sounded prior to the reading of the budget. I was expecting something that was a little more, some more austerity measures, but I was aware that the government would have been balancing the need for some austerity with the fact that we are more or less into election season. So when the Minister read the budget on Monday afternoon, all of 5 hours and 13 minutes, I must admit that when I reflected on it, I felt it was a cleverly crafted document, because he didn't give anything, he didn't take away anything, but he ensured that the majority of the population, by and large, felt very comfortable, because I think everyone was waiting with bated breath, given the alarms that both he and the Prime Minister had sounded. I think people were waiting to see, well, what was going to happen. I did note, however, that having gone to put fuel in my vehicle that morning, that there were no long lines that we traditionally see. So I felt that the right balance was struck for the majority of the population. Some things that I still think that we need to pay particular attention to, but that will come out in our conversation moving ahead. But as I said, I think it was a cleverly calibrated budget presentation.
Dr. Seerattan, your initial views on the budget?
The budget, I think, fits within the medium-term strategy that the government has had. If you look at the various budgets for the last 5 years, with the exception of the COVID years, the government initially, when it began its term, had some consolidation to do, and they were trying to transition to the growth phase of the medium-term strategy, but COVID got in the way, obviously. So I didn't, given the constraints we have on the revenue side, I didn't think there will be any significant different approach from last year. And if you look at the budget, if you look at the allocations and so on, it's relatively similar what we had last year. I think the Minister of Finance is being conservative in some of his estimates for revenue, and rightly so, because given the international environment in which we find ourselves, there are significant downside risks that could materialize in 2025. So you want to be positive, but you also have to take account of what could potentially happen. And I think the Minister mentioned the geopolitical problems we have in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and of course another major potential risk is the U.S. elections and what that would mean for international politics and so on. So I think he struck the right balance, and it was in keeping with his overall strategy for the medium term.
Dr. Seerattan, what was your major takeaways from the budget? We heard about, especially that last hour and a half, we heard about CL Financial, the 5% offer to public servants and so on, minimum wage, along with the point of a refinery. What was the major takeaways for you?
I think, some of the major, there was lots of different policy mentioned in that last part of the budget, but I think the major thing that we have to take away, that the sale of CL Financial, the 13 billion that he mentioned, that is going to be very important over the next 2 years, because of course we anticipate that energy prices is going to be relatively soft over that period. We also have some constraints on the supply side with respect to gas over those periods until 2027, more than likely. So that is an important, that together with the property tax, together with the Trinidad and Tobago Revenue Authority, major and significant parts of the budget, because that is going to help us navigate the next 2 years that are likely to be relatively difficult.
Dr. Attzs, it was a very lengthy budget presentation. I mean, since I've been in media 10 years, it's the longest I've ever heard it. I think it was just about 5 hours and 13 minutes. You called him the Mr. 513, the finance minister, but what was your major takeaways from it?
Well, it was a mixed bag. Some of what Dr. Seerattan would have already mentioned. And as I said in my opening statement, I felt the minister tried to strike a balance to ensure that every aspect was touched. So he looked at, in terms of the manufacturing sector, applauding the manufacturing sector for the contribution that they have made in terms of revenue shortfalls from the energy sector. He spoke about the special economic zones, all of these issues. He spoke about what I found interesting, the fact that they're going to ask energy companies to start to pay in US dollars, given the challenge we have in terms of the foreign exchange. And then coming down in terms of the fiscal measures, looking at issues of how we could enhance our human capital in terms of skills. So the digital training, conversations around the minimum wage for public sector workers, and we spoke about that at the post-budget forum, the fact that some of these workers, I would like to see them move from simply being engaged in short-term work programs into more skills development and long-term development. So, I will still maintain that I think that there is more that can be done for that category of workers than simply looking at how we can increase their minimum wage, because not all of them are going to benefit from the minimum wage because they don't all work for 8 hours, as the case might be. So they will not realize the full benefit. But I think the minister was clear. Even though no austerity measures were mentioned, he did state that the onboarding of the Revenue Authority would go a long way to close that leakage that the government has not had the opportunity to enjoy from tax revenues. And I think he said upwards of $10 billion, which is going to be important. So really it was a lot to unpack. Looking forward to some conversation around Petrotrin, because I think the fence line communities in that area have still not quite recovered from the fact that Petrotrin has been closed for all of these years, and they've not had the same level of economic stimulus and economic activity taking place in those areas. So I think there are a number of things to look forward to, but my concern, having heard, because a lot that had to be unpacked during the budget presentation, my concern is really the implementation, that we get to close on some of these issues that were mentioned, some of which will redound definitely to the benefit of the country.
One of my major takeaways from it within that last hour or so was that announcement of the selling the 49% stake in CL Financial.
That's right, yeah.
I was in the chamber when the budget was read, and I don't think my eyes could have opened any wider when I heard it. This was not something I don't think anybody expected. But what are the implications of this? Well,
the government needs money. I mean, it's a basic fact that, as Dr. Seerattan would have mentioned, and I think someone in your profession in the media is quite aware that the government is challenged. There are lots of things that will impact on revenue streams from the energy sector, including but not limited to the geopolitical risks. Dr. Seerattan mentioned the issue of the US elections. I think we should not miss the opportunity to let your viewers know that the outcome of the US election is not simply about whether you like Vice President Kamala Harris or whether you like Mr. Trump. There are geopolitical repercussions, including a conversation around Venezuela and the temperature of the relationships between the United States and Venezuela, depending on the outcome of the election. So I think it's not lost. So the government really has to find ways. And yes, I too didn't quite see that coming. As I said at another forum, I was a little speechless after the budget presentation, because there were some of the things that I didn't see that coming. But it is understandable, rather than have the assets and you're not able to monetize them, given you're in a situation where you actually need the revenue, you need to meet some shortfalls, it makes sense. It makes a lot of sense. And I imagine it will impact on the stock prices for some of those entities as well.
You talked about Venezuela, and we talk about Lauren Manatee. We talk about the Dragon gas field, which I believe they're expecting to come up in 2027.
That's right, yeah.
Some new gas and so on for the country. But in terms of, government talks about the revenue for this budget was basically $54.2 billion expected. Expenditures $59.7 billion. It was a fiscal deficit about $5.5 billion. Now, revenue was at $54.2 billion. Oil revenue was at just $14.17 billion. Non-oil revenue was $35 billion, and I know they would have spoke about it at one of the recent post-budget conferences. But How important are these to get that revenue of oil?
To get the revenue to get the oil revenue,
back up.
well, the oil revenue, that has been our mainstay, and one of the things that I think we also need to understand, certainly from my perspective, and I don't know, Dr. Seerattan may share my views, and he may also have his own views on it. We find ourselves as a heavily dependent energy economy. The pendulum globally, the geopolitics of climate change is causing there to be a shifting of the pendulum away from conversations around non-renewables, essentially the oil and gas sector. And while Trinidad and Tobago will depend on the energy sector for the foreseeable future, we have to start the narrative. And I think it might be fortuitous in a perverse way that we are facing these challenges in terms of depressed energy prices, in terms of lower production, because it now forces there to be some creativity and some innovation and some attention on the other side, so that we address the geopolitical concerns around non-renewables, but that we also discipline the country in a way that we need to look outside. So there is a conversation around how much the manufacturing sector has helped to kind of close that gap in terms of revenue, and I think that is welcome. What is required now is to ensure that the architecture to support the non-energy sector, essentially trying to fill that gap, you're talking about more or less $60 billion you're trying to get. The architecture has to be supportive in terms of ensuring that the ease of doing business, not simply in terms of some of the traditional issues that clog the arteries of how we do business in Trinidad and Tobago, but issues such as crime. I mean, nobody wants to go into business. No one is comfortable when having to deal with crime and security eats away at your bottom line. So it's a complex conversation. It's almost a set of simultaneous equations that have to be solved to get us to where we want to be. But I certainly do think that some caution, some conservatism, if I could put it like that, is called for looking at the energy sector revenues, because there's so much that is outside of our control, the geopolitical risks to which Dr. Seerattan referred. But even when you look at the non-energy side, to actually get them to fill that gap, or to help us fill that gap, also requires some work in ensuring that the architecture is conducive to their doing business.
Yeah. Dr. Seerattan, in terms of whenever we hear the budget, for the past 10 years I've been listening to the budget in terms of my media experience, but whenever we hear it, we hear about the budget and diversification. It goes hand in hand. Non-oil revenues are just about $35 billion. Do you think we're doing enough to diversify the economy?
Well, if you have been looking at the revenue figures over the last 5 years, the minister made that point, as a matter of fact, that revenues, even in this difficult economic environment, has actually been increasing. And if you look at the breakdown of revenues, I mean to say the energy sector has been relatively muted during that period. So the boost in revenues that we have been seeing is basically coming from the non-oil sector and VAT returns, VAT in particular. And you remember, this is in the context of where the government would have reduced VAT, the marginal rate on VAT, from 15 to 12.5, right? So I think the kinds of improvement we've seen in revenue is a reflection that there is some movement in terms of diversification, in terms of the service economy and so on, in terms of government better handling of the tax collection efforts and so on. That move to simplify the VAT by reducing the marginal rate but removing some of the exemptions. I mean to say, the last time we had comprehensive tax reform was basically in the early 1990s. So I think the kinds of improvement we see on the revenue side is both a slow but sure diversification of the economy. It's also based on improved administration of taxes, and that is hopefully going to improve further when we have the TTRA operating efficiently. And of course, you know, the diversification efforts that you mentioned, I think the most significant thing in this budget, and it's something that the minister would have mentioned on the last budget as well, is the whole pivot in the tourism side, right? And I've been saying this for like the past 5 years, that the only sector in Trinidad and Tobago that could replace the hard currency that we lost from what has been going on in the energy sector is the tourism sector, right? That is low-hanging fruit. The Caribbean already have a brand internationally in terms of tourism industry. There are things that we need to do to really up our game in terms of tourism development. The rehabilitation program for hotels, I think, is a very important thing. I'm to say, if you've been to Tobago recently, even in some of the best hotels, you could see signs of deterioration and so on. And you cannot really push tourism if you don't have hotel rooms up to a certain standard that people are accustomed to and so on. So the rehabilitation of the hotel rooms, what they're doing with Magdalena, what they're doing with the Hilton, those are very, very important things. But we have to also improve the number of hotel rooms that are available. So the recent introduction of the Marriott in Tobago, the minister mentioned there's interest from 3 outfits that are interested in setting up hotels in Tobago. Those things are absolutely essential, right? Because when we look at the tourism arrival, we have to have tourism arrivals that rivals the amounts that Barbados. We probably would never get up to Bahamas, but definitely Barbados, probably Jamaica. Those kind of numbers of tourist arrivals is what we need to get to close some of the gaps that we have in hard currency, and the government is moving in the right direction. But I think given what is that Dr. Attzs mentioned in terms of pivot away from the energy industry, the whole issue about climate risks that are associated with the energy sector and so on, we have to pull out all the stops now in terms of pivoting and using the tourism industry as a pivot, because you don't want to wait until oil revenues or revenues from the energy sector get to such a low point that we are having significant problems in meeting our bills and so on. You want to do it in a way that you could get to a certain level before that eventuality happens. And I mean, I always use the example of the OECS countries. In the 1995s, Marlene may know, but they were struggling with transitioning from banana to tourism to a service-based thing. And they basically transitioned in about 10 years. Right? So if you had gone to the OECS countries in the early 1990s, it was a different kind of jurisdiction you went to.
And they also had to circumvent the frequent hurricanes they were facing during that period.
Exactly. But the point I'm making is people don't understand. One of the biggest industry in the United States is tourism. Yeah. If I'm not mistaken, is the 3rd most important industry. So people think of tourism as something that small islands do, right? But some of the biggest tourism destinations in the world is in the developed world. They got a lot of money from that particular sector. And to me, that is an obvious way for Trinidad and Tobago to navigate some of the challenges we have in terms of the energy transition. And the minister, by some of the policies he have adopted, have been going in the right direction. I just think we need to have more of it.
I just want to piggyback on a couple of things. It's interesting when Dr. Seerattan mentioned the United States. I was reading recently that the creative sector in the United States is one of the largest contributors to their GDP. And ditto for Jamaica. Someone was making the point, can you imagine if they had patented the word or copyrighted the word reggae, how much money they could have made in Jamaica off of things like that. So yeah, there are opportunities for us to reimagine. And while I agree with Dr. Seerattan, and I think, yes, we do have a natural advantage in the Caribbean because the brand is already there, the tourism, etc. These issues have to be predicated on people feeling safe and secure to come to us as a destination, because I've been in contact with a couple of the tourism sector stakeholders within the recent weeks, and crime has in fact been impacting on their business in terms of tourist arrivals, because people are cancelling at the 99th hour because they hear the latest set of 5 murders, etc., etc. So it's both in terms of what is happening in reality in Trinidad and also the reporting. So I think as we try to make this transition and to capitalize on sectors like the tourism sector, we have to understand what is the brand and how we market the brand, and how we need to deal with issues such as crime that can have a negative impact.
I want to get into crime very soon, but in terms of the national security allocation. But before we do that, diversification and agriculture. Agriculture received just under 2 billion. I believe it was 1.184 billion.
That's right.
In terms of agriculture, I mean, are we seeing the benefits from it? Is it being diversified? I know government has in the past few months or the past few years pivoting into homestead the
That's
Youth
right,
Agricultural Homestead
Ministry of Youth
Program,
Development, right, yes.
and so on, shade houses as
That's
well.
right, yeah.
And so many other things going on, agriculture, with the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Youth Development. But are we seeing would those basically come into being as soon as possible to get that agricultural sector going?
Well, a couple of things. One, I think this allocation was a tad smaller than last year's allocation to agriculture. Again, it depends on the resources available to the government. And you're correct, there are some, so while that was the allocation to the Ministry of Agriculture, some of the allocation to the Ministry of Youth Development also will be channeled into their agriculture programs, etc. I think we need to consolidate and align rather than having 2 and 3 ministries trying to achieve the same objective. Yes, we'll probably get to the same end goal in terms of increasing local content out of the agriculture sector, but we really need to be careful when you operate in a space that we have scarce resources, that we ensure that we get the greatest return on that investment, wherever the investments lie. One of the things I want to say about the Shade House program, I think it's an excellent initiative, getting our young people involved, because many of our farmers are aged persons and you want to introduce technology, you want to have a new generation of persons involved in the agriculture sector. But a good thing would be what becomes of the output from those shade house programs, for example? Is it that it's going to be dedicated to the school feeding program? Is that the direct market for it, a guaranteed market? What are the prices going to be paid? Because young persons will want to go into sectors where they show that they can earn a decent standard of living and income to look after themselves and their families, as the case might be. I do think the recent initiative to have the Food Security Committee is a good initiative. I would have liked to see a different composition in that committee, but we also have to remember that we are part of CARICOM, and there is the CARICOM 25 by 25 initiative that was agreed to, and I don't think we are as advanced as some of the other countries, particularly Guyana, for example. 1, because of the land issue. 2, because the champion of 25 by 25 is in fact the president of Guyana, so he's keen to show that they are advancing in Guyana. But I also think ours in Trinidad and Tobago is also a historical challenge. We have grown so dependent on imports. Remember, we've always had the financial resources from energy to allow us to buy whatever we wanted to buy, to import whatever we wanted to import. And now, because of what is happening in the energy sector, we have to change our taste. And you know, when I sat at a forum with the Minister of Finance and he was asked the question about changing tastes and culture, etc., you know, I wanted to whisper to him, you know, we could go back to the good old days of banning the import of certain kinds of foods that we could grow locally. But I know that, we want to see ourselves as having a liberalized market, but there are choices that have to be made, because until and unless we consolidate the efforts, we involve farmers in the conversation around the agriculture sector. Farmers should not just be add-ons, but they really need to be an integral part so that they can speak to what are some of the challenges they face, some of the things that they need to see. And it's not just about land and accessing some of the agriculture incentives. And there are a lot of agriculture incentives. But some farmers, with whom I interact, say that you can't get access to some of these incentives because they don't have things like land tenure. So we have to consolidate and ensure that the architecture for agriculture and allowing us to treat with the large food import bill is consistent with and aligned with the needs of our farmers, the people who are actually on the ground, no pun intended, trying to help us achieve food security in Trinidad and Tobago.
Dr. Seerattan, health, national security, education. In the past 5 years or even more than that, those were the 3 that were in the top tier of allocations, in terms of allocations. Just for our viewers, health would have received 7.57 this year, billion, that is. Last year they received 7.4 billion. Education would have received this year 7.51 billion. They received just about 8 billion last year. And national security got 6.1 billion. They received 6.9 billion last year. Are we seeing the benefits of these large investments?
Well, you have to understand that the allocation to those ministries is predicated simply on the amount of people employed in those sectors, right? So the education sector is a large sector with the university, with secondary school, primary schools, and so on. So there's you remember that about upwards of 90% of the allocation for any ministry is for personal expenditure, right? So it is predicated on the number of people employed in those different sectors. National security is also large because we have the police service, the Coast Guard, etc., right? So the number of people employed by those ministries would mean that their their allocations are always large. Now that in itself is a problem because you're talking about expenditure that you cannot really change, right? And if you're talking about increases in salary, it means that the allocation to those ministries are going to become even more entrenched. So the government cannot pivot, for example, away from more recurrent expenditure to spend more on capital expenditure, which is more growth enhancing, for example, right? So I think we are stuck with the allocations for those ministry. And from my point of view, I don't think we need to necessarily increase the expenditure for those ministries because we have to focus now on efficiency. I mean to say in the area of national security. We have been throwing money at national security for the last 20 years with not a commensurate improvement in national security outcomes, right? So clearly it cannot be the amount of money that is allocated to these ministries and so on. So we have to have a national conversation about the expenditure efficiency and approaches to management of the public finance, such as performance-based budgeting, and you give more money to ministries that actually demonstrate that they have done things in terms of outcomes and so on. Those kinds of approaches is what is needed, and increasingly that is the standard practice in governments. But we have to have a laser focus on value for money. Yep. Because my reading of those ministries that you talked about is not so much about increasing the allocation, is ensuring that you get the efficiency of the expenditure up so that the number of hospital beds, the number of children graduating from secondary school, the amount of the reduction in crime, those are the metrics we have to be focused on in relation to the amount of money spent on those things. I would have done some research on expenditure efficiency for the Caribbean, and you will be amazed at the differences between our peers and Trinidad and Tobago, right? So you may not be familiar with this approach, but the Pareto optimality approach, where you look at value for money. So in some of the cases, we are definitely lower than our Caribbean counterparts in terms of those things. The worst area was on infrastructural spending, where the marginal efficiency in Trinidad and Tobago was about 0.20, which meant that for every dollar you spent, you was wasting 80 cents. Right? So there are metrics that you could use to evaluate how efficient public expenditure is. And I think if you focus on those things, the discussion about how much more money to spend on crime or on education is going to be less of an important thing, rather than what we are getting from these ministries when we spend all this money on these industries. So that focus on efficiency rather than the number of dollars that the minister allocates to health or education or national security is very important, and it's particularly important in national security because, as Dr. Attzs mentioned, crime impacts on economic activity, not only in the tourism sector, but also in the real industries and so on, because people have to make all kind of allocations, all kind of expenditures related to securing their plant, their employees, and so on. So that whole focus on efficiency is something that we need to pay attention to. And in the Caribbean generally, you know, when you look at studies on productivity and efficiency and so on, we are low in terms of the international benchmarking. So that is definitely an area where we could focus on, is less on the amount of money we allocate to these ministries and more on how the money is actually used.
If I can just weigh in on that, because I think it's such a crucial point. Every year the population gets caught up in who get what, who get eight, who get first, who get second, who get third. And certainly for the last 5 years or so, personally, because I've been doing this kind of commentary for a little while now, I've kind of become very jaded, because it's less to do with the amount of money, but what is the return on that expenditure that we, the population, can attest to. So crime is a classic case in point. I mean, it has been beaten more than a Good Friday boboli, if you can pardon my expression, but we certainly are not seeing. So a conversation that says that there are 2,000 more police vehicles going to be on the road, I think is a bit more irritation to the population, because you could never really get the kind of assistance you want when you call a police station. Very often they tell you they have no vehicle. There's a public accounts committee report that says they themselves are concerned about the wide range of models and makes of vehicles they have, which they question whether it's fit for purpose. So these are the people who are really managing the purses, saying, well, hang on a second, is this fit for purpose? And I think it relates to Dr. Seerattan's point about efficiencies. Do we need to look at the internal processes in some of these ministries to ensure that the organizational structure is appropriate, that we're looking at the correct metrics, what is the detention rate in terms of crime, detention rates, prosecution rates, of course, that's also linked to what happens in the judiciary. But it's really less about the allocation, but how do we feel after all of these things? I mean, there was a conversation within the recent weeks since school reopened about the state of some of the schools, the fact that some schools are still in a state of disrepair, and I think those are of more concern to the general population. So you're not just talking to two economists, but the population really wants to know, well, what is really going on? Having had, if the population can wrap its mind around what is $7 billion, why are we still having these challenges? And I think that is where, as a nation, as a country, we need to have the conversations moving in those directions.
The minimum wage, we saw it increase by $2.
For public sector,
for public sector,
workers.
And not the private sector. And that issue, along with the 5% offer to unions as well.
Yes.
I mean, that was a big surprise to me. But your thoughts on these two issues?
One, anything that allows for persons at the minimum wage level to get some more income, to be able to have some more in their pockets, given increases, pending increases in utility rates, general cost of living increases, it is always welcome. But as I've made a point, in other areas, that we also have to look again at not simply persons who are at that level and keeping them in those areas, but how do we allow them to move on to areas where they can, I use the term self-actualize, but that we can give them some skills that they can use, because very often persons in the minimum at that level are persons who may have not completed their levels of education, so they may have gone into these jobs. I mean, I heard the Minister of Finance say that he knows some persons in these particular categories, the MTS, the URP, and the CPEP, stay in those jobs. I think he mentioned URP as the example, for like 40 years. They come in at age 20 and then they stay there until age 60 and then they retire from those areas. So I think while it is a welcome change, additional $2 probably will cause some angst in the private sector, although in some private sector areas they were already paying above the minimum wage, and it may cause some angst. I don't know that persons will migrate from private sector jobs into the public sector jobs. I think that was one question that a journalist posed, whether they think it will cause people to migrate, and I really don't know that people will migrate from the private sector into a CPEP program or URP program for an additional $2. The 5% I found interesting because it's almost as though it's going to cause, and it has started to cause some reverberations among the trade union movement. They're saying that, this was not negotiated, how you could just drop this there, because let's face it, workers will probably want to encourage their representative unions to take the 5%, take it and run, because as, Dr. Seerattan and I have been saying, we don't know what lies ahead in terms of the government's fortunes and its ability to raise revenue. So I do hear some of the trade union leaders coming out and saying, we need to have a conversation around this. You can't just drop this 5% and expect us to take it. But I quite suspect that many workers who fall into those bargaining units may be encouraging their unions to move, to press on and to contemplate the 5%. So it was an interesting strategic move, an interesting chess move, and we'll see how it plays out in the coming months.
Dr. Seerattan, your thoughts on the 5% move for...
I think the 5% move was a very strategic move by the Minister of Finance.
Yes.
And I mean to say, the main point is that probably at this point in time, that's the amount of money that the government can afford, right? I think the Minister mentioned that amount is going to cost additional $475 million in recurrent expenditure.
Per month, to pay the workers in those categories.
Right. No, and in the context of the fact that wages and salaries account for about 90% of recurrent expenditure, that's already going to be a problematic thing, right? The amount of money spent on the minimum wage for people in the government sector, I think, is $75 million. That's the cost. Like that, that's not a material thing. And as Dr. Attzs mentioned, you really have to ensure that people at the lower income still get a certain minimum wage that will allow them to live comfortably, and prices have been going up recently. So to me, I think the minimum wage, even though we would have had an increase in the minimum wage, I think in last
budget,
budget,
17%.
it is still something that you need to pay attention to. The wages policy in this country is something that we have to pay attention to. That has implications for productivity, it has implications for poverty, it has implications for social stability. And for far too long, we have had wage negotiations done in a very combative, in a very hostile environment. And I think we need to take wage negotiations out of the political cycle. So, unions and so on will start lobbying around the time when no elections are due and so on. And that does not allow us to have a more cerebral approach to the kind of wage that will help us to move people up the social ladder, that will help to improve productivity, that would help to incentivize people at the higher scales to be more productive and so on. So I think we need to, that is a very, probably one of the most important policy areas in terms of the national dialogue, and it has not gotten the attention it deserves. So I agree completely with increasing the minimum wage for people in the government sector. I suspect the minister didn't want to improve the minimum wage overall because businesses and so on might have said that, this is going to cause problems for us and so on. But although Dr. Attzs indicated that people are not going to move in droves from the private sector to the public sector, there's a kind of demonstration effect that eventually, if people realize that you're going X amount in the government service, it is going to be contingent on employees in the private sectors. They might need to go up, although the minimum wage have not gone up. And I think that is very important because I always tell people, when we talk about economic policy, this whole thing about productivity, balanced budget and so on, all those things are not ends in themselves. They are means to an end, and the end that we are looking for is to improve the welfare of the country generally, right? So all those metrics that we talk about in terms of productivity and efficiency and so on, that eventually have to be something and things that are directed at improving the overall welfare of the country. And because of the kinds of increases we have in prices and so on, you need to increase the nominal wages for people so that they keep pace with inflation. But of course, in the context of the public sector, the minister has to be guided by what is possible. Because the same people who will lobby for increasing wages is the same people who are going to knock the minister for having fiscal deficits and for the public debt going up. You have to choose, you have to strike a balance between those kinds of things and the welfare of the country. And I think by and large, the minister has gotten the balance right.
Dr. Seerattan, the Minister of Finance would have said in the budget that Cabinet is currently deliberating on the increase for electricity rates. Given that they have received a recommendation from the RIC, did it come as a surprise that there was no increase, no decision so far?
Well, I think the last response from the government was they're actively considering, because the RIC, what the RIC does, it sets maximum rates, right, based on what is the efficient cost that TNTech would have submitted, right? So, but it is the government decision to say whether they go in with that rate that would have been suggested or whether it's a lower rate. So the government cannot set the rate higher than what the RIC has recommended, but they can set the rate slightly lower and they can stagger it over a number of period of years. And I suppose the overriding concern that the government may have had is all the talk about increases in the cost of living and so on. They didn't want to pile further increases on the population at this time, but it's not that they're not considering a rate increase at some point, right? In terms of the TNTech electricity rate, if you look at the rest of the Caribbean, even with the increase, Trinidad and Tobago will still have the lowest rate per kilowatt in terms of every other Caribbean countries. I think the only country up until recently that will have a lower rate than us would have been Suriname, and that's because Suriname have a lot of hydro, and they could afford but even in Suriname, they recently had an IMF agreement, and the IMF basically told them, the utility is losing money, you have to increase the rate. So even with the increase in TNTech rates that is likely to come with the rate review, the RIC rate review, it will still be the lowest rate in the Caribbean. So I know people have gotten accustomed to very low electricity rates and so on, but You know, that was a time when we had dollars flowing in from the energy sector. Money wasn't a problem then, but now, I mean to say, in the current environment where you're constrained in terms of revenue, you have to manage your affairs in a particular way. So the gravy train, so to speak, cannot last forever, right? And people need to understand that if you do not properly resource TNTech, what happened to South Africa? I always give the example of South Africa, where they have load shedding for almost 8 hours of the day, right? And that happens because, remember, when you're building up generation capacity, it doesn't happen in 1 year. You probably take about 5 to 10 years to build up your generation capacity and so on. So therefore, when you're looking at demand and you're looking at the capacity that you have to think very strategically about how you're going to improve capacity. And the only way you could do it if you spend more money, right? So you have to understand that the rate increase is to ensure that TNTech is sufficiently financed in a way that it could make the investment that is necessary to keep our electricity infrastructure up to the level that we want it to be.
And I mean, I completely agree with everything that Dave has said, that we have to get the population in a space where they understand these things cost. And the gravy train, as Dr. Seerattan has put it, the gravy train is kind of drying up. But I also am aware that, it's election season and we're going to be a little kind of cautious about how we want to pile on additional costs onto an electorate, because people will not soon forget that, and they can become issues that cause challenges from an election perspective. So I think let's not lose sight of that can also be a consideration. But I absolutely agree that we really need to find ways to ensure that the population, it's almost as if we have become so dependent on the revenues from the energy sector that now that things have to change, the cultures have to change, the tastes have to change, we have to get the population into that space of understanding that things are going to be a little different in Trinidad and Tobago moving forward.
US $78.80 per barrel. That's the oil price. The finance minister has set that the budget is pegged on basically that. Is this a fair estimation?
I think he was being very conservative because, again, the number of geopolitical risks that are out there, the minister has to hold his hand. We saw shortly after the budget was read, or while the budget was being read, we saw some activity taking place in the Middle East, which may have caused some uptick in prices, but we can't really rely on global wars to keep Trinidad and Tobago's revenues flowing. But there are a number of geopolitical risks, and I think the minister was being conservative in terms of his estimates moving forward.
Yeah, I think he was definitely conservative in the prices that he pitched to base the budget on, and it more than likely would have had to do with some of the risks, let's say, on the environment. But strategically, it's always better to underestimate than to overestimate, right? So I think the price for the gas price in particular was a little bit on the conservative side. But again, this is something, you remember, the prices on which you benchmark the budget is going to determine how much revenue you have, and therefore, by extension, how much you're willing to spend.
That's right.
So I was pleasantly surprised that the minister did not go overboard in an election year, because I am sure the temptation to do that would have been very, very strong. And he did the responsible thing by kind of being relatively cautious in terms of the prices that he set the budget at. Hence
my notion of cleverly calibrated, because I think it really was almost magical, the way in which he kind of walked that line. So people are not too unhappy. They're not quite happy, but they're not too unhappy. So kind of struck the balance there. Because yes, there's so many things that can impact on the amount of revenue that the government earns. So many things beyond our control.
The Heritage and Stabilization Fund, it currently stands at about 6.1 billion. What does this mean, and what happens when government dips into this?
Tricky question. Really want the answer? Okay, all right. So, Heritage and Stabilization, a lot can be said about it. When we developed our fund, our sovereign wealth fund, the Heritage and Stabilization, it was developed with future generations in mind, because we're dependent on non-renewables, so we leave something for future generations, consistent with the tenets of sustainable development. But it's also meant for stabilization. So it is meant to help the government meet its obligations when there are shortfalls. That is the nature of how it is done. So COVID-19, we were fortunate to have a Heritage and Stabilization Fund that the government could dip into because we were faced with a crisis. We were faced with something that was almost existential. We just did not see this thing coming. And we had to keep body and soul together of the country. We had to keep public sector workers paid. We had to pay our healthcare workers. We had to import vaccines. We had to identify funds for consumables for the people in the healthcare. And it really was a crisis time. So fortunately, we had the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. That said, in one of my previous lives, as a member of the Economic Development Advisory Board, we did make a recommendation to the government that it be separated because it's one pool of funds, and if you're faced with, so if this year things don't go our way and the government is really very challenged in terms of meeting its revenue estimates, the Heritage and Stabilization, because you don't want to increase your borrowing, because we're already at 74% or thereabouts in terms of our debt to GDP ratio. So while you want to be able to dip into the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, you don't want to be using it, and particularly since you can't control the geopolitical risks to which you're exposed. So it is a tricky situation, which is why the government has resorted to some levels of borrowing in the past, which is why they're resorting to selling some assets like the CLICO assets. They're resorting to, bonds, floating bonds on the local domestic, the international and the domestic markets. So they're using a combination of efforts of monetary instruments to essentially try to help them navigate this space. Yes, we could have had more money in the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, but as the minister correctly pointed out in his budget presentation, since 2014, 2015, we have been facing challenges. The country has been facing challenges in terms of lower energy prices, and then coupled to that, we've seen declines in domestic production. So we really have had a bit of a challenging time, and it's only within recent years that the manufacturing sector and some of the other non-energy sectors have come into this space and allowed there to be increased revenue from those sectors. So it is a balance to be struck. Yes, more could be done, but we can't ignore the fact that we had COVID-19 for almost 2 years, and were it not for the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, we would have been further challenged. But then even on the international market, there have been some challenges. There were some challenges about 2 years ago in terms of the portfolio and the impact of global investments, global economic environment impacting on our portfolio. And we did lose some funds, but that is normal when you're trading on the international market, that sometimes your portfolio may take a hit.
Yeah. We can't leave a conversation and not talk about Tobago. Tobago would have received, I think, 4.35% of the budget. It was $2.376 billion, upwards of $22.7 million from last year, where they received $2.576 billion. Do you think the THA would be happy with this allocation?
Well, when you look at the overall budget, I think nobody's ever happy with the allocation that they get, right? Even if you talk to various ministers and so on, the Minister of Health, the Minister of Agriculture, they would in private, they will never be happy about the allocation they get. But remember, the minister is dealing in an environment where you have limited resources, and therefore, by definition, everybody is not going to get the amount that they requested, right? So I think given the situation that the country finds itself in, I think it's a fair allocation to Tobago, and you have to remember that in addition to the allocation that goes to the THA directly, there are indirect allocations to Tobago. So for example, the capital project that is improving the Tobago airport is not reflected in that $2.6 approximately billion that goes to Tobago. So I think, so sometimes when we look at the allocation that goes to the THA, is a misnomer, we're not looking at it right. You have to look at the overall resources that is being spent on Tobago and Tobago's development need. And given that Tobago is going to be the sharp edge of the sword when we're talking about pivoting to the tourism industry and so on, we need to spend more money on Tobago, right? But I think the government is doing the correct thing. So, for example, the hotel rehabilitation program, I mean, this is Tobago desperately need money for hotel rehabilitation. We definitely need an improvement in that airport, because if you've ever been to the Tobago, it is not up to international standard, particularly if you want to ramp up the number of tourism arrival. You could imagine a plane with about 300 people on it coming into the airport at the same time, or multiple planes, right? So the infrastructure needs to be improved in Tobago, and I think the government is doing what it can. There's the plan for the marina in Tobago. I think we need to do something in terms of the cruise tourism facilities in Tobago, because I don't think the port in Scarborough can accommodate the kind of ships that you want to see in terms of cruise tourism. So those kinds of things needs to be done, but again, those things are capital intensive project, and given the amount of resources that we actually have and and what we expect to happen in the international arena over the next 2 years, you have probably that is something that you can plan down the road. But I think definitely improving the airport in Tobago is a big thing. The hotel rehabilitation program is a serious thing, and I see the government have extended it until 2026, but they need to keep that program going until all the hotels are rehabilitated. And finally, I think the marina is a great idea, and of course, something needs to be done in terms of the infrastructure for cruise tourism in Tobago, because if you look at how the tourism is going in other Caribbean countries, cruise tourism, long-stay tourist arrivals is the money-making part of the tourism industry. But cruise tourism allows you to have a cash flow outside of the long-term stay arrival. So cruise tourism is an important component of the tourism industry, and the minister also mentioned things about event tourism, things to do with CPL, things to do with Carnival, the fact that Carnival in Tobago is in October rather than February, so you have a longer period. All those kinds of things are very, very important if we want to make sure that the tourism sector reaches the potential. We wanted to meet some of the income needs that the country has at this point in time.
Dr. Seerattan, based on global trends, I mean, do we see this year's budget addressing the main areas of concern?
In terms of the international environment?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the minister, as we have both indicated, has been cautious because the kinds of geopolitical trends we see happening, the geopolitical events, has major implications for commodity prices in particular. Not only food prices, but energy prices, which is our bread and butter, right? If you look at the revenues, for example, over the last 5 years, it went up significantly in 2022, 2023, because basically commodity price went up, right? Now, most people have come to the conclusion that the international commodity markets have priced in the risk related to Iran and the Middle East, and the price that the risk related to Russia based on what's going on there, right? Russia being one of the major oil producers and so on. But in terms of our own interest here in the region, what goes on in Venezuela has huge ramifications for us, because it means that we are going to get much more oil, not much more gas from the Venezuelan fields and so on, right? So those things are the most important determinant of what goes on with growth in Trinidad and Tobago, right? It is not what the government does. It is not what the private sector does. It is what happens in the international arena with respect to global economic growth and commodity prices. Those are the most important thing impacting on growth for Trinidad and Tobago. So I think the government has done the best it can in the context of the potential risk they see out there in the market, and we have both said that the minister has been very conservative in the prices he pitched the budget at, both for oil and gas. And I suspect that the reason he have done that is because he see risk out there in the market. And one of the biggest risks that people have not talked about yet is if Trump wins, right? The reason the price of oil has been relatively high over the recent past is because the Democrats have all kind of environmental concerns, yes, yeah. And they have
a strong climate change agenda, the Democrats, yeah.
But if Trump comes in, he is going to basically change up the policy.
He has no climate change agenda. In fact, he doesn't think climate change is real.
No, but the point, it doesn't matter about what he's going to do is going to mean that U.S. oil production and
Yeah.
gas production
It's going to be ramped up.
Is going to be ramped up, which is going to soften
That's right.
international energy prices.
Yeah.
Right? So that's a new risk. I'm not so sure that the international commodity markets have priced into the estimates for the price of oil and gas going forward. So that is something that the minister has to be very cognizant of, because you don't want to set yourself up for failure and set the price at the $84, which is at the high end of the range, and then you find that it's $60 a barrel. That's a huge gap to make up. So I think he have obviously taken all these things into account, and I think I think the price he have set the budget as is conservative, and it is in keeping with what the potential downside risk on the international arena could look like in 2-3 years' time.
How does our economic indicators compare to other Caribbean countries and other countries at our level of development?
All right. So we've not enjoyed, because of the nature of our economy, the fact that we're so heavily dependent on the energy sector, we've not enjoyed levels of economic growth that we can be happy about. It has been extremely modest levels of economic growth because we are so heavily tied to what happens in the energy sector. Compare that to countries like our tourism neighbors, those neighbors that are heavily dependent on tourism, Jamaica, Barbados, for example. COVID, of course, the economic growth would have plummeted because no one was traveling to go anywhere, so there was no tourist arrivals. So we would have still seen some modest kind of growth in terms of the value of the energy sector. But post-COVID, those countries have rebounded and they now have, better rates of economic growth than Trinidad and Tobago. But I think it's not simply, as I would be the first person to say, it's not always about, and then you have outliers like Guyana, which has taken off and is enjoying double-digit economic growth because of the new kid on the block in terms of the energy sector. We have aged, more mature energy, a more mature and aged energy sector. Guyana is the new kid on the block, so I think they should be treated as an outlier in terms of the economic growth. People have tried to compare what is happening in Guyana with what is happening in Trinidad and Tobago, and I think it is not a fair comparison, because when you take the economic growth, when you look at Trinidad and Tobago's long history in terms of what the energy sector has done for Trinidad and Tobago, we continue to be one of the better off Caribbean countries in terms of things like our human development indicators, which is one of the United Nations indicators. So Trinidad and Tobago we continue to have a fairly decent per capita income because of the wealth that we've enjoyed. We have some challenges. So crime, as we keep identifying as a pain point for Trinidad and Tobago, is not unique to Trinidad and Tobago. You're seeing levels of crime increasing in some of the other countries. But by and large, I think Trinidad and Tobago, we have done well. We have suffered some challenges as a result of the shortfalls, the declines in the prices in the energy sector and our lower production. Some of our tourism-dependent neighbors have seen some growth in their economies as tourists return to their countries, and identified Barbados and Jamaica as two of our neighbors that have enjoyed. But Trinidad and Tobago, I think it's not simply a question of looking at the economic growth figures, but looking at where we are as a country and the progress that we've made based on the energy resources that we've enjoyed for many years. I wanted to be cheeky in terms of, the fact that we had a CPL game that didn't get interrupted, but, we're going to leave that there.
Where would you both like to see more emphasis or focus on in the national budget?
I think I would have mentioned this before. I think we are moving in the right direction in terms of pivoting and trying to diversify the economy and choosing tourism as one of the main sectors that we're looking to make headways in. But I think because the energy sector is always going to be the large kid on the block, we have an alternative when you compare ourselves to the rest of the Caribbean. The rest of the Caribbean know that tourism is their bread and butter, right? But I think that given what is going to happen over the long term in terms of the maturation of the energy sector, we need to start planning now in terms of how we pivot to diversify. And to me, all the things that we have been doing so far in the recent past is good, but we need to do more of it. It's just a degree, right? And I suspect that the fact that we have not pulled out all the stops in terms of pivoting to the tourism industry is partly related to the fact that no matter the fact that the energy sector is maturing, it will still be a dominant player in the end. So we have an alternative, so to speak, right? But I think policymakers have to recognize you don't wait until you have no choice but to pivot. You have to pivot now because, of course, pivoting when you have no choice is extremely painful, right? So I think we need to do more in terms of the investment in the tourism industry. I also feel that we, in terms of the problems that we have in Trinidad and Tobago, one of the main problems is import intensity. Because the fact that we have such high import intensity, that's the proportion of imports in the overall economy, is that it have a natural corollary on the foreign exchange market side. So people don't realize, they talk about foreign exchange shortage now, but people don't realize in the heyday of high oil prices in 2005, 2006, when oil was $147 a barrel, there was still an imbalance in the foreign exchange market. Demand still exceeded supply. So this is a structural problem in our economy related to the fact that we have our import intensity is so high. So Dr. Attzs mentioned the thing about food. We will never be self-sufficient in food, but we could reduce our dependence. There are certain things in the manufacturing sector where we have imported inputs. So you import inputs to the manufacturing process. You buy screws, you buy all kinds of things that conceivably could be manufactured in Trinidad and Tobago. So you have to have a very focused program in this country about reducing import intensity, both in the agricultural and the manufacturing sector, because they are low-hanging fruit that we could exploit. I do not agree with Dr. Attzs about banning imports, because we have experience of banning imports. If you could remember,
back in the day, yes.
Back in the day, we had banned cars, and the cars you used to get, you had to wait 3 years to get a car, one. And secondly, somebody had a joke that, when they were finished doing the assembly of the cars, there was a whole bucket of bolts and nuts that they didn't know where they were supposed to go.
So even if we don't ban, I do think that we have to have policy instruments in place to control that intensity to which you're referring.
No, but you intervene on the supply side.
So however it's done, so it's not about banning. I don't think and no government is going to take us back to those days.
Those are the bad days.
No government is going to do that, because that will be political suicide. But there has to be something done. You made the point about structurally, there has to be something done to cause the population to understand that things have to be done differently.
Yeah, I'm agreeing with you. So the intervention has to be on the supply side, right? So we need to produce more food that we could there's no reason why we should be importing tomatoes, right? There are no reason why the price of locally produced tomatoes should be more expensive than foreign tomatoes. There should be no reason why an apple is less expensive than a mango. And yet when you go into the groceries, this is what you see. So it goes back to efficiency again, right? And if you're not efficient, if you're not organized, then you're going to see these kinds of outcomes. And so it's less about money being thrown at these things in terms of agricultural production and light manufacturing production. Is more about efficiency and how organized you are, right? Because that's the difference between developing countries and developed countries, is how efficient and how organized you are, right? And that is where we fall down, not only in Trinidad and Tobago, but the rest of the Caribbean.
Dr. Seerattan, your final thoughts?
I think people always wait with bated breath for each budget, but they don't realize what a budget could do to change things significantly is constrained by the policy levers that the Minister of Finance has available to him. So when you're looking at the budget, we basically want to look at what is the medium-term strategy, right? So that's the most important thing. So this budget can't be looked at in isolation. It has to be looked at, the budget has been delivered over the last 5 years, and essentially the government was trying to pivot from stabilization to growth, and COVID-19, the pandemic, interrupted that for about 2 years. So I think from 2023 and this budget and the next budget, you could see the Minister of Finance, any Minister of Finance, focusing on getting the economy growing much faster, right? So I think if we could hit about 3% growth per annum, that would be great. But what we need as a developing country to back up all the development goals we have, all the social goals we need to be hitting about between 4 and 5% growth per annum going forward. And the only way we could do that is if we make significant improvement in the way we produce, the productive infrastructure in Trinidad and Tobago. So that's why it's so important when we talk about the tourism industry. Any enhancement we could make, any enhancement and improvement we could make in the energy sector, any enhancement we could make in the agricultural sector, any enhancement we could make in the manufacturing sector. And all those things could pivot around one main theme, which is reducing our import intensity. Because if our import intensity was 50% rather than 80%, we would not have the problem in the foreign exchange market. We would not have a problem in terms of employment. We wouldn't have a problem in terms of granting people the wage increases that they deserve. All these things are predicated on growth.
There's a saying that says if it's not measured, then it can't be improved. We need to measure what is the impact of the expenditures that we've undertaken. So whether it's 50 billion, 55 billion, 59 billion, 60 billion, 61 billion, what is the return on the investment to the people of Trinidad and Tobago? Yes, we can boast of having a highly educated population, but is that population, is the return on that investment in education, for example, redounding to the benefit of Trinidad and Tobago? Are they just being trained? Are we training people for export? What is the return on the investment in the Ministry of Health? Can we see improvements? What's the return on the investment in terms of the agriculture sector? All of these things, I think, and now is a good time for us to focus on that conversation, because resources are scarce relative to the amount of money that we'd like to have. And it's a good time to see whether or not how we allocate, whether we're allocating in the most appropriate places so that we have targeted interventions to yield maximum results for the people of Trinidad and Tobago.
Yeah. Well, we have been speaking with economists, Dr. Dave Seerattan and Dr. Marlene Attzs. Thank you very much for joining us. It's been a very comprehensive analysis, and thank you very much for joining us.
You're most welcome. Our pleasure.
Right.
Join us at the same time next week for another episode of Delving Deeper. I am Sonolala. On behalf of the entire group, have a great night.